In this video, we're going to be looking at the Vietnam War from the years 1955 to 1975. So the key players involved in this are Ho Chi Minh, and he is the leader of North Vietnam, which is a communist country. Ngo Dinh Diem, to begin with, is the leader of South Vietnam, which is a capitalist country supported by the United States. This is all again an example of communism versus capitalism, communism trying to spread and the capitalists trying to stop that spread. The US presidents involved in the Vietnam War are President Eisenhower from 1953 to 61, the first president to send military advisors into South Vietnam to help, President Kennedy from 1961 to 63, President Johnson 1963 to 69, who was the first president to send combat troops into Vietnam, President Nixon and President Ford, who were the presidents seen as responsible for helping to end the war in Vietnam. Okay, let's look at the background then to the Vietnam War. So, Vietnam had been controlled by the French, and Ho Chi Minh had been fighting against the French to control the whole country. He'd been trying to fight for Vietnamese independence against what he classed as foreign invaders, foreign rulers. Now, in 1954, to stop the war between the two, it was decided that Vietnam would be split, and that was decided at the Treaty of Geneva. Now, Vietnam therefore was to be split there. This would be South Vietnam, and this would be North Vietnam. Now, in the north, that would be ruled by Ho Chi Minh, who, remember, is communist, and the south would be ruled by Ngo Dinh Diem, and he is capitalist. Now, this is where the Americans come in, because they support Ngo Dinh Diem. Obviously, they don't want communism to spread into the south. Now, the Treaty of Geneva did say that after 2 years, the two Vietnams would vote in elections to decide on one ruler, on who would control the whole of the country, and therefore unite the country back into just being one Vietnam. Now, it was thought that in 1956, 80% of people in South Vietnam would vote not for their leader, Ngo Dinh Diem, because he is brutal, he is unpopular, and they would instead vote for Ho Chi Minh. Now, this, of course, would then make the country one united communist country, which is what Ngo Dinh Diem and the USA want to avoid. So they cancel the elections. So this doesn't happen. And this causes outrage among South Vietnamese and North Vietnamese who want the country united again, and they want Ho Chi Minh to be their leader. So what is set up is the National Liberation Front, or the NLF. We know it as another name, which is the Vietcong. Now, the Vietcong, they were based in South Vietnam, and they were fighting against Ngo Dinh Diem, and they're trying to overthrow him in the hopes that they can overthrow him, and what would happen then is that Ho Chi Minh would be able to unite the country under a communist leadership. And by 1964, there are around 100,000 Vietcong soldiers in South Vietnam, and they use a tactic known as guerrilla warfare, which we'll come to later. And there is a real possibility that South Vietnam could fall to the Vietcong and could be taken over by the communists of North Vietnam. The ARVN, who are the South Vietnamese army, are very weak, and they are unable to fight against the Vietcong successfully, and it looks like they they're going to lose. The Vietcong are going to defeat them. So there's a real possibility that South Vietnam could be taken over by communists, which completely goes against the American policy of containment. They do not want communism to spread. So obviously the Americans don't want to have South Vietnam become communist, so they increasingly get involved in Vietnam under 3 presidents, starting with President Eisenhower, then Kennedy, and ultimately Johnson, who declares war on North Vietnam. And there's several reasons for this. So number 1 is the fact that the ARVN, South Vietnam's army, is too weak. So to defeat the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army, President Eisenhower and then Kennedy sent military advisors, American military advisors, to help train the ARVN so they can fight an effective war. The idea was that if they were strong enough to fight the communists, then the communism wouldn't therefore spread into the area known as Indochina. And that's the areas such as North and South Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. Now, by 1964, as we said, there are 100,000 Viet Cong, but there's also 16,000 US advisors in Vietnam who are helping to train the ARVN. So it's the idea of train them, and that will contain communism. Okay, the next reason for why the US got involved is because the South Vietnamese government was corrupt. So that's Ngo Dinh Diem. So after the French left, the new Vietnamese leader, Diem, became very unpopular. He gave his family all the best jobs, and this annoyed lots in South Vietnam. Hence why a lot of them are wanting to vote for Ho Chi Minh in the cancelled 1956 election. Now, the USA felt they needed to help him with money to try and increase his popularity. However, in 1963, Diem is assassinated. The Americans helped to do that. But no leader after Diem of South Vietnam was much better. 40%, in the same year, 40% of rural South Vietnam is under Viet Cong control. So again, real possibility that South Vietnam could fall to communism, meaning the Americans needed to get involved to try and make this government a lot more stronger and a lot more powerful in order to defeat communism. The next reason is containment, started by the Truman Doctrine. So the US wanted to contain or stop the spread of communism around the world, and they said they would support any government such as that one there, South Vietnamese, who were threatened by communists. They also knew that the USSR and China were both supplying North Vietnam and the Viet Cong with weapons. So by getting involved, they could stop the spread of communism, which is ultimately what the Truman Doctrine wanted. Okay, so another reason was the domino theory. Now, this is the theory that if one country became communist, then neighbouring countries would follow. So, like a stack of dominoes, you knock one over and the others follow. So the USA was concerned that Ho Chi Minh would spread communism from North Vietnam into South Vietnam, and then it would follow on to Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and so on and so forth, and may eventually threaten the USA. So by getting involved again, they can stop the spread. And the final reason the Americans get involved is one reason that is simply only to do with President Johnson, and that is the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, this takes place on August 2nd, 1964, when the USS Maddox, an American battleship, is apparently attacked by the North Vietnamese in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, this is seen as a declaration of war by the North Vietnamese on the USA. So as a result, President Johnson asked the US Congress, their parliament, for free rein in dealing with the North Vietnamese. This leads to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and basically President Johnson then declares war on North Vietnam and starts sending in combat troops. So these aren't military advisors. So it's not these guys. These are actually soldiers who are going to go and fight the North Vietnamese, and they're going to go and fight the Viet Cong. So actively putting American troops on the ground. And by 1968, there are 500,000 US troops in Vietnam fighting to stop the spread of communism, to prevent the domino theory from happening, to help the South Vietnamese government, and to prop up the ARVN and help them fight an effective war against the communists. Okay, so let's start looking at why America loses the war in Vietnam, starting with the tactics of the Viet Cong, which were really effective in defeating the American army. So the first tactic of the Viet Cong was the fact that they used guerrilla warfare. Now, guerrilla warfare is simply hit and run tactics. So they didn't fight face to face with the American army. They attacked whenever they got the opportunity, and then they would retreat as soon as America started to fight back. They did not wear a uniform, which made them incredibly effective because the US soldiers would not know who was a Viet Cong soldier. So it made US soldiers scared. And also contributed to US soldiers killing the wrong people, killing civilians, which in turn led many Vietnamese to start supporting the Viet Cong. So there's many innocent people being killed by the American army because they simply don't know who a Viet Cong soldier is, and they're very scared that it could be anyone. So then the Vietnamese civilians, they turn to the Viet Cong for protection, they turn to the Viet Cong to give them their support, and it makes the Americans' job a lot harder. They also used underground tunnels, which again made it hard for the Americans to follow them or to find them or to know where they were coming from. And the reason for all this was because they were heavily outnumbered and outgunned by the American army. So instead, the Viet Cong used their environment. It was an absolute nightmare for the American soldiers. Absolute nightmare. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, and they lived therefore in constant fear of ambushes. Another tactic that the Viet Cong used, similar to guerrilla warfare, was booby traps. Now, these were hidden in the jungles. They were easy to make, and they were cheap to make, so you could make them just out of materials you had lying around the jungle, such as just tree branches, bamboo sticks, and so on. Now, they could be placed anywhere, and they contributed to 11% of US deaths. Now, that might not seem a lot, but that wasn't the aim of these booby traps. It was the whole idea to scare the US soldiers and, again, create this fear among American troops. The idea was that they would go back to their base injured by booby traps, or seeing a fellow soldier injured or killed by a booby trap, and they would tell the stories to other soldiers, and this would spread fear. Now, a scared soldier is an ineffective soldier, and it also leads to them killing the wrong people again. And another tactic the Viet Cong used was use of their neighbours. And by this I mean Laos and Cambodia. Now what they did there was they simply jumped over the border. They were allowed to go into these countries for safety. It gave them a safe place to retreat to, and the idea was that the US soldiers were not allowed to follow. They're not at war with Laos and Cambodia, so they can't go into those countries without permission, which they've very rarely got. Now all this, like I say, leads to this whole culture of fear, of being scared, of killing the wrong people, and also, as a result, US soldiers on average were 19 years old, and they only did 1 year tour of duty in Vietnam. So their whole idea was that they simply wanted to get home. They were fresh out of college and they just wanted to go home after their year's service. So when their officers were telling them to go into the jungles where they knew the Viet Cong may have set booby traps, they may have been about to carry out a hit and run ambush, they basically didn't want to fight there. And sometimes this led to what we called fragging, which was where very inexperienced, as most US soldiers were, inexperienced soldiers would throw a grenade into their officer's tent and kill them. And that was the idea, that they would then not have to follow their orders and might live to fight another day. So all in all, the Vietcong tactics were very, very effective at fighting against the American army. So now we'll look at how US tactics contributed to their failure as well in Vietnam. So the first tactic we start off with is bombing. That was known as Operation Rolling Thunder. And it started in 1965 and lasted until 1972. The idea behind that was to destroy Viet Cong strongholds, supply routes and cities in North Vietnam to force their surrender. Now the effect of this was it did start North Vietnam wanting an end to the war, but also the main problem with bombing was that Viet Cong used underground supply routes, or they used what was known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a series of different routes between North and South Vietnam, and there was lots of different ways to get from point A to point B. So the bombing only ever disrupted the Viet Cong getting supplies. It never stopped them. It never did. Now, another tactic used by the Americans, which was very controversial, was the use of chemical weapons and napalm. Now, the chemicals that we used were called Agent Orange and Agent Blue. And effectively, these were used to poison the food supplies, poison the crops, poison the water, and still to this day, people still suffer from the chemicals that were left by those attacks. Napalm was used to burn everything it touched, and this was used to combat the idea of the Viet Cong using the jungles for safety. It was easier to destroy large areas of jungle rather than sending in soldiers to fight them. And like I say, it's very controversial. It killed many, many civilians. And more began to support the Viet Cong as a result. So they stopped supporting the American army and they start supporting the Viet Cong. And another tactic the Americans used was search and destroy. They would basically, the US forces would use helicopters to land in villages and kill Viet Cong soldiers. However, it was hard to fight the Viet Cong due to their use of guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong left traps for these search and destroy soldiers. The wrong villages were sometimes attacked and burned down. Lots and lots of civilians were killed again, and it made the US very unpopular. The US carried out what were called Zippo raids, where they would basically use their Zippo lighters, throw them into the Vietnamese wooden houses and wooden villages and burn them to the ground. So again, it all contributes to this idea of the US becoming extremely unpopular, the Vietcong gaining more support due to the tactics that the USA are carrying out. Okay, so now let's start looking at some of the events that contributed to the Americans losing the war and deciding to get themselves out of Vietnam, starting with the Tet Offensive. Now, this was in January 1968. It was thought the Viet Cong controlled the rural areas of South Vietnam, whilst the USA and the South Vietnamese government controlled the major cities. It was thought the Viet Cong were too poorly equipped and too disorganized to actually ever launch an attack on the USA in their strongholds, and the USA actually at this point thought they were winning the war in Vietnam. However, like I say, in January 1968, the Viet Cong launched an attack on 100 US controlled cities, and it catches the Americans completely by surprise. Now, the Viet Cong had hoped that the ordinary people in these cities would rise up against the Americans and the South Vietnamese government, and that they would be able to beat them. However, they were wrong, and the result was that 10,000 Viet Cong soldiers are killed. So it's a huge number for them. However, the main idea behind the Tet Offensive now is that it becomes the turning point of the Vietnam War. And that's because before the Tet Offensive, the USA had been convinced that they were going to win the war and it was going well. People back at home in the USA thought very much the same. However, it became clear that many, many more troops and more money would be needed to defeat the Viet Cong. The US thought the Viet Cong couldn't plan such an attack and that they had strong control of major cities, but like I say, they were very, very wrong. And this makes President Johnson start to look for ways out. In fact, Walter Cronkite, who was a popular news reporter at the time, he went on TV and he said the war was unwinnable, and he actually was considered to be even more trustworthy than the president of the time. So that's the first reason, the Tet Offensive. Okay, the next event we're going to look at is the My Lai Massacre. This takes place in March 1968, which is the year before the Tet Offensive, but we don't actually find out what happens in My Lai until 1969. Now, this was when US soldiers led by a Lieutenant Calley of Charlie Company went on a search and destroy mission to the village of My Lai. Now, they were told that they were meant to be looking for Viet Cong fighters who were hiding in the village, but they didn't find any, but instead 400 civilians, including women and children, were killed. Now, this was originally, because of how horrific it was, covered up by the US Army. But a year later, in 1969, one of the soldiers came forward and told the US media about what had happened, and then photos start to emerge from the massacre and published on the front of American magazines and newspapers and so on, showing babies and women being killed by the US Army. Now, the result of this was that the soldiers were put on trial for mass murder. Only, however, Lieutenant Calley was convicted. He was found guilty and he was sentenced to 20 years in jail, but he only served 3 years in jail. Now, the main consequence of the My Lai Massacre was the level of shock that the American people had. They couldn't believe that their own soldiers were capable of such horrific actions, and it loses support for the war. At a time just after the Tet Offensive, when people are already starting to have doubts about their troops being involved in Vietnam. And also, some of the soldiers, when they returned home after this event, became known as baby killers. So that leads us on to looking at US public opinion of the Vietnam War and why that led to the failure. So first off, thinking about the media. So the Vietnam War is known as the first TV war. TV took over from newspapers as the way that people got news. So they started to see video reports of graphic and shocking violence, such as what happened in the Lai Massacre and such as what happened during the Tet Offensive. They saw horrible things that the US Army was doing in Vietnam, and as a result, they took their support away from the war. There's also the idea of Walter Cronkite, as we mentioned. Reporters such as him said that the war was unwinnable, and that had a massive effect on public opinion. So again, turning people away from the war, and the consequence was that people started to demand their soldiers home. Another group of people who protested against the war were students in the USA, and also in other countries around the world, such as Britain. Now, in 1970, there was an event known as the Kent State University Massacre. And what happened here was that the US Army opened fire on a group of student protesters who were protesting against the Vietnam War, and as a result, 4 students were killed. So these are American citizens killed because they were protesting against the Vietnam War. And again, that led to demands for soldiers to be returned home, that the war in Vietnam should be over. Now, the students, partly the reason why they were protesting is because the war showed massive inequality in the United States, which also links into this idea of civil rights between African Americans and white Americans. So the war, like I say, it shows this massive inequality. 22% of all casualties in the Vietnam War were from black Americans, whereas 11% were white. But there were less African Americans in the army. It also showed massive inequality between poor people and rich people in America. So, for example, poor people at 18 didn't have the money to attend university, so therefore they were drafted into the US Army and sent to Vietnam. Whereas the rich in America could go off to university, and therefore they could avoid the draft. They didn't have to go and fight. So in essence, you had lots of African Americans who were poor, so as a result, lots of African Americans did end up going to Vietnam, where more were killed than white Americans, and lots of poor white Americans ended up going to Vietnam because they simply couldn't afford to go to university and avoid it going. So, like I said, there is a huge concern, and that's probably the best way to put it, huge concern of the amount of US soldiers who were fighting in Vietnam. So there's roughly about 500,000 by 1968. And the horrible things that they are doing there is causing outrage back at home. So like I say, all these things come together and has a massive effect on public opinion, and people simply want an end to the war. And that was the main idea behind public opinion. Massively unpopular. In fact, one phrase at the time was, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids are you going to kill today?" And President Johnson realised that there was no point him running for president again, so he decides that he's not going to run for election in 1960. As a result, President Nixon wins the election, and partly the reason is because he's promising that he will end the war. So one of the reasons he wins the election is that he's promising to end the war in Vietnam. So he had several options. The first was simply not to surrender. America is still in the Cold War with the communists, and they don't want to simply hand South Vietnam over to the North Vietnamese and over to the communism. So it's still, he has to follow this policy of containment. So one, not surrender, because he still needs to contain communism. But he realizes America has to leave this war. So his key policy is Vietnamisation, and that's a key phrase. And all that means is to train the ARVN so that America can leave the war, so US troops can withdraw from Vietnam, but yet still the ARVN can contain communism and still defeat the communists, the Vietcong. President Nixon also begins to look for a diplomatic way out, so peace negotiations with North Vietnam. And partly the reason for that is because Operation Rolling Thunder, the bombing of North Vietnam, has brought North Vietnam to the negotiating table. They want an end to the war. So Operation Rolling Thunder did have some limited successes in that regards. And also, the Americans under President Nixon asked other communist countries such as the USSR and China to put pressure on North Vietnam to get them to come to the negotiating table, which they do in 1973, when we get the Paris Peace Accords, which effectively ends the American involvement in the Vietnam War. They get a promise from the North Vietnamese that they will not spread communism into South Vietnam and they will not invade South Vietnam, and the US in turn withdraw their forces, and the last combat troops leave the South Vietnam in 1973. However, in the end, North Vietnam did invade South Vietnam, and this was in 1975. It only took North Vietnam 55 days to conquer South Vietnam without the American soldiers being there to protect South Vietnam. So it showed that the policy of Vietnamisation, and that is training the ARVN so they could fight effectively against the North Vietnamese without the US Army, had failed. It hadn't worked. So finally then, what we need to look at is basically the reasons why the US does fail in Vietnam. So we can look at things the US did wrong and things the Viet Cong did effectively. So, in terms of the Americans then, the reason why they failed is because their high-tech weapons ended up killing the wrong people. And as a result, they lose support from the people they are trying to help, and that is the Vietnamese civilians. Likewise, the morale of the troops was rock bottom. The US soldiers simply did not want to be there in Vietnam, and as a result, they were ineffective. They don't want to be there, like we talked about, fragging their own officers. The US was trying to supply a war 8,000 miles away. And a lot of the people back at home just simply didn't understand why they were fighting a war that far from their own home. So therefore it became unpopular in the USA too. The 1-year tour of service meant, again, that US soldiers were always inexperienced and they weren't effective at fighting. On to the Viet Cong then, and why their tactics lead to their victory over the USA. Well, the guerrilla tactics were extremely effective against the US Army. The US Army simply didn't know how to combat hit and run tactics and an enemy that doesn't wear uniform or use underground tunnels and so on. The South Vietnamese people hated their own government and therefore supported the Viet Cong and the communists. Remember, 80% of them wanted to actually have united with North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh in 1956. The North Vietnamese, and therefore the Viet Cong, were highly motivated, so a complete contrast to what the US troops were like. They wanted to be there. They were fighting for their own country. And like I say, that's a massive contrast to the fact that the US soldiers were fighting in a country 8,000 miles away from their own home, and many of them just didn't understand why they were there. The VC were determined to drive out the Americans, whatever the cost. And finally, like I say, the South Vietnamese people sheltered the VC, and these were the people the US thought they were trying to help, when in fact they would have preferred to have been controlled by the communists of North Vietnam.